So welcome back to another week and another meeting of 151C. The Thursday we looked at the politics of the long 18th century from 1714 through to the Peterloo Massacre of 1819. Today we're going to look at the big social and cultural and intellectual changes of that period of time, and on Thursday we will look at the economic transformations that occurred at that used to be known as the Industrial Revolution. So the critique of the new imperial British state that emerged after the revolution of 1688 and the new political movements committed to reform it that I discussed did not come out of nowhere. Indeed, they were made possible by the emergence of new enlightened ideas from John Locke to Mary Wollstonecraft to reimagine and theorize anew the relationship between the state and its subjects. Of course, the state placed real limits on what could be said and what could be done. But nonetheless, there were dramatic expansion of both the content and the form of public debate in the 18th century, and it's that which is the primary focus of this lecture. This was an amazing development, considering that the civil wars and revolution that had occurred during the 17th century had meant that the central question that historians have got to ask is, how did society become civil enough that the sectarians and political debates of that period of time, those conflicts that had torn apart that society, became relatively normal or normalized, and not just tolerated by the state, but, as we saw with the growth of loyalism, actually used by it. Now, usually this concept of civil society as this realm of public debate is conceived as happening outside of the state in voluntary organizations. But I'm going to suggest to you today that the shape and parameters of civil society in Britain can't be quite so easily separated from the state or from, more broadly, the forms of government that began to develop during that period of time. Nonetheless, measured in terms of the proliferation of public debate and the appeals to a public as the legitimate basis of support for any position, as well as the numbers and types of voluntary organizations and associations, Britain's civil society was arguably the first to emerge from the ancient regimes of Europe's old world. But that happened not as a consequence of some innate British genius. Enlightened ideas were, first of all, a transnational formation. They took shape in Britain around also its imperial expansion and encounter with the New World. Moreover, the Enlightenment shouldn't be seen simply, the emergence of this new type of enlightened civil society of public debate shouldn't be simply seen as the emergence of a new type of intellectual emancipation. The social theorist Michel Foucault famously described this process as creating not just new liberties, but also new types of disciplines, of new rules of how it is that people were supposed to be free. And finally, I'm going to suggest to you that at the end of the 18th century, Britain's ancient regime was not simply challenged by this new development, but had become more secure than any other in Europe. And in fact, that the forms of customary thought and organization that structured social life continue to have a strong hold for many people. So again, this is a story of important new developments, but new developments that simply didn't simply displace the old world, but that grew out of it and around it. So let me begin this lecture by talking about the social order of the 18th century. British society in the 18th century was highly hierarchical and deeply structured around a series of very finely graded forms of social distinction, of different ranks and orders, different stations and degrees, of different sorts of people and different classes. These are all terms used to describe the various distinctions that made up the social hierarchy. Indeed, when the tax official and statistician Gregory King investigated the state and condition of England in 1688, he detailed no less than 20 different types of social groups and described them as being differentiated by, quote, various ranks, degrees, titles, and qualifications. That is to say, we have here not simply an early type of sociology, of distinctions of social type, but a jumble of different types of forms of distinction by political office, by economic occupation, and by social location. And these were still very much in place when Joseph Massey undertook a very similar exercise in 1759 and 1760. And you have a handout before you, which is the compares and contrasts the two different studies by King and Massey, which I'll return to in a moment. What I'm suggesting to you is that in many ways, Britain's social order was closer to a caste society than a class society. It was conceived as a natural order, even as a divinely ordained chain of being, a perfectly calibrated system of mutually supporting divisions of rights and duties that structured all sections of society. And these distinctions were determined largely by birth. Whatever role one was born into was the role that one was expected to obediently perform for the rest of one's life. The Tory man of letters, Samuel Johnson, remarked that the British were naturally schooled in subordination to these hierarchies by, quote, the fixed, invariable external rules of distinction or of rank, which create no jealousy since they are held to be accidental by birth. But whether these were products of the accidents of birth or of a divine order, either way they were legitimated, these types of social distinctions and hierarchies, they legitimated a grossly unequal division of wealth and power. And that social order reproduced itself. The aristocracy and gentry strictly regulated their rights of inheritance through laws of primogeniture and entail, which ensured that their estates were left entirely to the eldest son, and that he was legally bound to do the same for his eldest son. The other sons were given lump sums or annuities or posts in the military, the church, or the court, or as a government official. And this, of course, became the basis of the radical critique of the old corruption of the aristocracy. Similarly, the area of politics became also an increasingly dynastic affair. In 1754, over half of MPs had followed in the footsteps of their fathers, and over two-thirds had some broader family connection to the House of Commons. The professions also tended to, the professional classes also tended to reproduce themselves by birth. A third of the clergy of the Anglican Church had followed their fathers, and the emerging legal and medical professions also tended to reproduce themselves through family lines. Marriage was often a key way for the maintaining of social status and forms of social distinction. Women with dowries were designed, the use of dowries for daughters was designed to find them a husband who could secure their position in life or even improve that of the family as a whole. The trade in daughters on the marriage market reflected the utterly subordinate position of women. The reproduction of the aristocracy, of the political classes and of the professions occurred through men. Women had no legal rights, for marriage ensured that they became the exclusive property of their husbands, and they lost all rights to their own property or of custody of their children. The strictly hierarchical nature of family life, in a sense, reflected the deeper structure, hierarchy of the social order itself, with men ruling as patriarchs over women and children, whose duty it was to obey. Mary Astell, one of the early British feminists, wrote in her Reflections on Marriage in 1700, "If men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves?" Now, I want to emphasize that although I'm suggesting that this social order reproduced itself in an almost caste-like way, there weren't legal barriers to social mobility. And here the caste analogy breaks down. It was possible, social mobility was possible. It was just exceptional. And there were famous cases of people proceeding from poor backgrounds to become rich and esteemed. So Captain Cook, the naval hero, Captain Cook and Admiral Nelson, the poet William Wordsworth, the landscape architect Capability Brown, all of these people came from humble origins to great social and prestige. But I would suggest they were the exceptions that proved the rule. Now, I want to now detail the precise layout of this social structure through your handout, which that you see behind me. So the population of England and Wales in the first half of the 18th century was between 6 and 6.5 million people, and if you add Scotland, you would get an extra 1.5 million, remembering that Ireland is not formally part of Britain until the Act of Union in 1801. Out of this population was structured through this plethora of different ranks and degrees and stations, which I'm going to try and detail for you now. At the top of this social hierarchy were the aristocracy, those with hereditary titles as dukes or earls or marquises or viscounts or barons and lairds. There were very few in number of this high aristocratic class. Around 100 aristocratic families had such hereditary titles. They possessed vast landed estates. Indeed, they owned almost a quarter of all the land in Britain, and that excluded their often extensive colonial holdings as well. Their income came from rents from these landed estates, and the surplus capital that they had from these rents was invested often in financial incomes, in financial markets. This created often very considerable incomes for these families, up to a peak of something like £30,000 a year. And their influence and their sons were everywhere, in the royal court, in the leading positions of the military, in the foreign service, in the House of Commons, as well as, of course, in the House of Lords. By the end of the 18th century, there was arguably no other aristocracy as rich or as powerful or as entrenched as the British aristocracy. Just below them were the gentry classes. This was a capacious group of about 20,000 significant landowners, some with titles as peers or knights, as lords or sirs, down to more humble gentlemen. Their incomes could range from £2,000 a year to £300 a year. This was the world portrayed in Jane Austen novels. The gentry were JPs, Justices of the Peace, they were members of Parliament, and distinction and forms of social distinction and their place in this hierarchy were so important to them that a whole series of new guides were produced. Guides like Debrett's and Burke's began to publish in the late 18th century and early 19th century to enumerate and classify the various forms of social distinction between them. Below this group were those who aspired to be gentlemen, who wished to become part of the gentry. And they took a number of forms. There were people in the business and in the professions. There were some 10,000 merchants, some 80,000 manufacturers, and some 20,000 professional types like medics and lawyers and clergy and teachers. Their incomes could again range very broadly from something like £40 to £600 a year. Below them were the freeholders and farmers, many of whom were tenant farmers on the great aristocratic estates. There were some 350,000 of these people, and their incomes ranged from 40 to 150,000 a year. And then alongside them came the shopkeepers and the respectable tradesmen, about 180,000 in numbers, with incomes ranging from 40 to 400 pounds a year. Some tradesmen and shopkeepers could be really of considerable wealth. And all of these figures are amalgamation from the figures of both King and Massey that you can see on your handout. Taken together, all of these groups, all of the aristocracy, the gentlemen, and all those aspiring to be gentlemen, amounted to something like a quarter of the total population. Below them lay the vast mass of the British population, and they came in two further groups. Artisans, whether they were masters or journeymen or apprentices across any hundreds and hundreds of trades. There were some 220,000 tradesmen of this type, earning probably around less than £25 a year. And then beneath them came the unskilled labouring poor, the majority of the British population, about 60,000, about 60% of the population, living on less than £10 a year. Now, I want to make one final point about this social order, that central to the hierarchical nature of this system and to the entrenched power of those at the top of it, lay three key institutions: the monarchy, the Anglican Church, and the universities, all of which were had immense wealth. Indeed, there's very little work that can has actually interrogated how wealthy the monarchy was. In 2009, just to give you a sense of the continuing wealth of the monarchy, the personal assets of the royal family were valued at 2.7 billion pounds, consisting from cash and investments to $1 billion worth of artworks, to jewellery worth 130 million, to the land valued at 895 million pounds, and so on and so forth. In addition, there was a crown estate, the income of which was only surrendered to Parliament in 1760 in exchange for the granting of a civil list by Parliament to help support the expenses of the monarchy. The Crown Estate was valued in 2010 at £7.3 billion, 4.5 billion of which came from its London property holdings, but there were also an additional 274,000 acres of land across the country. So, as you can see from the continuing wealth of the monarchy in the early 21st century, the wealth of the monarch was substantial in the 18th century. Similarly, the Anglican Church, the established Anglican Church, was really the next wealthiest institution. It held 1 million acres of land, 16,000 churches, 30 cathedrals, and 10,000 rectories and parsonages where its clergy lived. The total value of these holdings was estimated in the 1830s to be worth £35 million and provided the church with an annual income of £7 million. In addition to this wealth, the Anglican Church occupied a powerful political place. Bishops were appointed by the Crown, and they sat in the House of Lords. And if this political power, if this entrenched the political power of the church was also insinuated into the hierarchy of the social order, not just in the appointment of clergy to the sons of aristocrats and gentlemen, but in the very structures of the churches and their graveyards. So every church would have pews where the social hierarchy of the locality would be laid out in who got to sit where during the church service, just as the graveyard had special areas for the aristocratic families, other areas for those for tradesmen or merchants, and of course unmarked graves for most of the poor. Finally came the ancient universities. Remember that Oxford and Cambridge were the preserve of Anglicans only, although the Scottish universities were open to nonconformist Protestants. The wealth of these ancient universities is again considerable, and so considerable that to this day no one has really figured out how rich colleges in Oxford and Cambridge actually were in the 18th century. They had extensive land holdings across the country and growing and sizable endowments. To give you one example, St John's College in Oxford has an endowment valued in 2010 at £313 million. So, if that was the hierarchy of the social order and the key institutions that propped it up, let's now look at some of the ideas that began to challenge this type of social order. And here I'm going to be talking about this phenomena called the Enlightenment, which is often linked to a story about secularization and the secularization of British society. But I'm going to be suggesting to you today that the Enlightenment didn't lead to any straightforward account of secularization, and that instead religion proved a very important midwife for civil society. That religion, as much as the Enlightenment, helped catalyze the emergence of new forms of public debate and social organization. But to do that, I have to first tell you about the state of the Anglican Church and the evangelical revival that sprang up within it. The Anglican Church, as we've seen, was made up very often of the sons of aristocrats and of gentlemen, and this meant that there were very often large numbers of absentee clergy, of clergy who were not resident in the parishes that they were responsible for administrating. Thus, to give you one example, in Devon, in the southwest of England, in 1780, up to 70% of parishes had absentee clergy who did not live there and very rarely came down to preach there. Similarly, in Wales, very few members of the Anglican clergy actually spoke Welsh, which was the predominant language in many parishes. These factors meant that the state of the Anglican Church was not so robust for much of the 18th century. Indeed, as late as 1801, at the big festival of Easter, it's estimated that only 10% of the population actually took communion on Easter Day, one of the holiest days of the year. In fact, probably the holiest day of the year, next to Christmas. It was in an attempt to revive the Anglican Church that we have something called the Evangelical Revival. And this was pioneered by, firstly, a group of undergraduates at Oxford from the 1730s who tried to develop a more direct, informal, and heartfelt relationship with God, and mediating it through preaching, prayer, and music. They developed a new method of worship, and as a consequence came to be known as Methodists. Now, Methodism didn't break from the Anglican Church until 1791, and the greatest success of Methodism tended to be in those areas like Cornwall and Wales and Scotland, and indeed in the North American colonies and the new industrializing urban centres of the Northwest around Manchester, that the Anglican Church seemed to have its most attenuated hold upon the local population. Part of the success of Methodism lay in its charismatic preachers, who, as you can see in this image behind me of John Wesley preaching in Cornwall, John Wesley being one of the key leaders of the Methodist movement, or it's one of its most famous preachers alongside George Whitefield. These preachers took their evangelical message outdoors to very humble audiences, of which included often the working poor. They did not need the institution and the physical space of the church to spread the message of God. Methodism led to an enormous proliferation of sings and hymns describing the experience of conversion and of being born again in a new type of revived faith. Indeed, the intensity of the religious experience of Methodism was predicated in part on the terror of recognizing that sin was everywhere and that constant vigilance was needed to ensure that one did not fall prey to it. So there was this carrot and stick. The carrot was this intense personal engagement with God, and the stick was the fear of sin and of the terrors of damnation. Now, there were important theological differences between those like Whitefield who believed in predestination and those like Wesley who believed in free will and the potential to escape damnation. But these were less important than the profound engagement and development of new structures of religious practice that the Methodists developed. And they did that through a variety of ways, not just through preaching networks of regular circuits of traveling the country to preach, but the publication of sermons, of hymnals, and as I've suggested, they published their own journals and eventually built their own chapels and organized annual conferences that had generated this important and intense debate within the broader Anglican movement. Indeed, something of the moral fervour of this evangelical revival was evident across the church, and the leader of the church of the Anglican Church, which is always the monarch, began to embrace some elements of this, and this is most famously evident in George III's proclamation for the encouragement of piety and virtue, and for the preventing and punishment of vice, profaneness, and immorality in 1787, which is one of your readings for this week. This evangelical revival and the moral fervour it created led to the proliferation then of a whole series of attempts to morally reform the conscience of the nation and to spread the word of God and save the British people from their sinful ways. A whole series of new moral reform organisations developed, particularly from the 1760s. So the Society for the Reformation of Manners, which had actually been formed earlier, was re-energised in the 1760s. The Society of Universal Goodwill was formed in 1786. The London Missionary Society in 1795. The Religious Tract Society in 1799. The Anglican Church Missionary Society in 1799. The Society for the Suppression of Vice in 1802. And the British and Foreign Bible Society in 1804. The point here is less to remember the specific dates and organisations here than to get the number of new organisations devoted to the missionary effort of evangelical practice. Alongside these moral reform organisations were Sunday schools. Sunday schools that were designed primarily to teach the poor how to read so they could better study the Bible, and in some cases to teach the poor how to write. Sunday schools were not the preserve of the Anglican Church. Indeed, when the Sunday School Society was founded in 1785, it was explicitly non-denominational. By 1821, there were over 8,000 Sunday schools established, under half of which were affiliated to the Church of England. And in those over 8,000, it's actually 8,236 Sunday schools, there were 750,000 pupils enrolled. Now, there's been a huge debate amongst historians about the role of these Sunday schools and of the evangelical revival and of Methodism particularly. The historian Edward Thompson described Methodism as the Chiliasm of despair, accused it of psychic exploitation, and saw it as very much part of the counter-revolution that I talked about last week to instill obedience to the social order, to teach the poor social obedience. Other historians have argued that Methodism was an important avenue of new types of debate and public engagement, not least my colleague Thomas Kerr. Now, Methodists were not the only congregation to embrace evangelical practices. Dissenting groups, those like the Quakers, the Baptists, the Congregationalists, and the Presbyterians, had also pioneered new forms of worship, and this had been obviously going on since the beginning of the Protestant Reformation in Britain, but particularly in the 17th and 16th and 17th centuries. They believed, and I'm condensing a lot of different theological positions here, but these dissenting groups, these nonconformists, believed that God, not the monarchy or their bishops, was the true head of the church, and that God could be encountered directly by individuals through the study of Scripture without the reliance upon external authorities like the clergy. This meant there was a proliferation of sects around charismatic preachers preaching the Word of God and this more direct and intimate experience of religious practice. That's to give you one example. In the 1760s, a coal miner in the northwest of England named Dan Taylor built his own evangelical Baptist meeting house in a place called Hebden Bridge by digging and carrying rocks from the Yorkshire moors himself. By 1770, he had started the Baptist New Connection, and over the following years, he traveled something like 25,000 miles, delivering over 20,000 sermons. By the time he died in 1817, the New Connection boasted some 70 affiliated chapels, as well as its own educational establishment, its own academy, begun in 1798. Now, because dissenters were not allowed to attend universities in England, they developed their own places of higher education known as academies. And these academies are hugely important because they were much more open to the new strains of Enlightenment thought than the Anglican Church. They were more interested in trying to transform religion into, or to reconcile religion with Enlightenment thought and practice. Thus, where Oxford and Cambridge remained a type of intellectual backwater dominated by the study of the classics and not the intellectual ideas of their own time, that emanating from figures like Locke and Newton and Hume or Smith, let alone Voltaire, Rousseau or Kant, the academies often embraced the study of these new ideas. I bless God that I was born a dissenter and I was not educated at Oxford or Cambridge, declared the former reformer, the radical reformer, Joseph Priestley. There had been 35 dissenting academies established after 1689, and many of these, as I say, focused on new practices of knowledge, things like focusing much more on math and science, and a more open spirit of inquiry, where reason, not just God, was seen as a basis of truth and authority. Indeed, figures like Priestley by the 17th centuries turned to the understanding of God through rational comprehension, famously with the creation, of course, of the Unitarianism and deism. Now, many of the members of the dissenting religions were increasingly critical of their exclusion, not just from the universities in England, but from the public offices, remembering the limited nature of the Act of Toleration and the Test Incorporations Act of the late 17th century. And it was they that often provided important criticisms of the ancient regime and the irrational systems of and monopolies of wealth and power based on faith and birth that it relied upon. It's no accident, I think, that some of the key radical voices of Britain's Enlightenment came from dissenting families, people like Thomas Paine, Thomas Spence and William Godwin, or inhabited those traditions, and I'm thinking of figures like Price and Priestley, or like Mary Wollstonecraft came to embrace the tradition of rational dissent. So the point that I'm trying to say here is that we shouldn't think of religion and enlightenment as two separate things. They were very much, in many ways, implicated in it as in important ways. But neither is it possible to reduce the Enlightenment simply to a branch of religious thought and practice. Now, it's long been thought that the very idea of an Enlightenment in Britain was an oxymoron, that Britons are so profoundly anti-intellectual and practical in their orientation that they eschew abstract thought. This argument was long held and suggested that the Enlightenment was something that happened on the continent of Europe. It was in the continent of Europe where you have proper intellectuals, and it was there that those intellectuals insisted that the world could be understood and organized by the practice of reason. A radical insight that promised or threatened to overthrow the inherited structures of rule and authority, as well as the bondage of superstition and custom in which the poor were seen to be held to. Rational, not historical or divinely ordained ways of organizing the world were now championed. And key to that was the idea of the empirical observation and experimentation to discover the natural laws that structured the operation of the world. Laws that could then be used to ensure the progressive development of man and to master nature and to ensure the progress of mankind. Now, I want to suggest to you today that Britain actually very much did have an Enlightenment, and that its Enlightenment was very much connected to the broader Enlightenment across Europe and the Americas. Clearly, a whole series of canonical thinkers, from Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke in the 17th century, all the way through to David Hume and Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham and Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century, show that there were serious intellectuals championing new, rational ways of understanding the world. Neither do I think that Britain's Enlightenment was necessarily more practical and bent on improvement than elsewhere. And we can see that, I think, in the reforms of Catherine II in Russia, or Charles III in Spain, or Joseph II of Austria, or even Louis in France. In fact, it seems to me to make very little sense to think of the Enlightenment as a national affair. It may have taken some specifically national characteristics, but the Enlightenment was basically a transnational phenomenon. Ideas, new ideas, the texts that helped propagate those ideas, and people all tended to cross national borders. Thus, Voltaire and Rousseau and Benjamin Franklin were all visitors to Britain. Adam Smith went the other way, visiting Paris and Geneva, where he met, among others, Voltaire, Franklin, and the French political economist Francois Quesnay. Thomas Paine is in many ways characteristic of this type of movement, living in America and France as well as in Britain. And of course, British intellectuals were writing in response to the ideas and texts published elsewhere. And the best example there maybe is Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Man, explicit refutation of Rousseau's theories about the education of women. The other important thing about where the Enlightenment was that Enlightenment ideas were very much shaped in Britain by its imperial encounters with the New World. Thus, the voyages of Captain James Cook, his 3 voyages to the South Seas, beginning with the first in 1768 and ending in 1779 when he was killed on the shores of Hawaii. Cook discovered Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Isles. His discovery, in inverted commas, not only helped advance the science of navigation and cartography that was very much part of the Enlightenment enterprise, but also generated a wealth of new botanical knowledge, as well as ethnographic observations of indigenous peoples in those places. Indeed, the forward march of reason and civility in enlightened Europe was increasingly understood in relation to these other people. It was widely assumed that those people and races deemed more primitive were simply at less advanced stages along the developmental path prescribed by the natural laws that govern the world, which were held to be universally true. Edmund Burke thus wrote, "The great map of mankind is unrolled at once, and there is no state or gradation of barbarism and no mode of refinement which we have not at the same moment under our view." And we see this nicely illustrated in this image here of the Pacific Islander known as Omai, who returned from one of Cook's voyages with the member of the Royal Society, Joseph Banks, an aristocratic botanist. And Omai was paraded around British society, high and low society alike. He had an audience with the king. He met the leading scientists and artists of the day, as you see in this image behind me, and he was subject to numerous pamphlets, plays, songs, and ballads. Indeed, his visit to Britain was the centerpiece of a marvelous new book by an old Berkeley alum known as Kate Fullager called The Savage Visit, a wonderful book that I recommend to you. But the Enlightenment's propagation of reason as the ordering principle of the world also rested not simply on the spread of new ideas, but on a new culture of public debate that was germinated in a myriad of new types of associations and institutions. Now, many of these institutions were in London and had a distinctly aristocratic or gentlemanly character, and they were often authorized by royal charters. Many of them also came out of aristocratic collections and houses. Thus you see The Royal Society was formed in 1660, the Society of Antiquaries in 1751, the British Museum, founded out of an aristocratic collection in 1759, the Royal Academy of Arts in 1768, and so on. But alongside these metropolitan and gentlemanly societies was a lively provincial culture. And the best example there is the Lunar Society in Birmingham, where a whole powerhouse of enlightened polymaths met to discuss their latest ideas and experiments. It included the natural philosopher and botanist and deist Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, Joseph Priestley, the dissenting reformer, Josiah Wedgwood, the man who was responsible for transforming the industrial production of pottery, who became a Unitarian and a supporter of parliamentary reform, and married Darwin's Erasmus, whose eldest daughter married Erasmus Darwin's son, James Watt, the mechanical engineer, and Matthew Boulton, also an engineer who improved the steam engine and made it commercially viable. Here you have a perfect collection of Enlightenment figures that emphasize both the intellectual engagement and their interest in the practical implementation of ideas to improve the world. At a more humble level, there was something known as the coffee house, rather like the coffee houses that litter Berkeley and now much of the world. The first coffee house had appeared in Oxford in 1650, but by 1739 there were 551 in London alone. These were places predominantly where men met to exchange gossip, news, ideas, exchange commodities, bets, even to offer professional services as medics or as lawyers. And many of these coffee houses became associated with particular types of activities. They became the foundation of new businesses or clubs or associations. Thus, Lloyd's of London, the global insurance market, was named after Lloyd's Coffee House. The London Stock Exchange also grew out of a coffee house. We'll see on Thursday. Indeed, the fashionable periodical The Spectator, which you've had as one of your readings today, provided a satirical commentary upon the new social world of coffee houses in London. The Spectator was precisely that, someone who observed the comings and goings of these coffee houses and the conversations and debates that went on within them. Despite having a modest print run of just about 3,000, its editors, Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, both Whig MPs and men of letters, claimed that it was read by 60,000, thanks largely to subscriptions by coffee houses and people reading them in those coffee houses. Coffee houses weren't the only humble institution of this new enlightened world of public debate. There were also large numbers of new types of clubs and associations. By 1750, London had 66 different types of associations and a total number of around 1,000. So 1,000 types of clubs and associations of 66 different varieties. Bristol, in contrast, had a dozen types of different associations. Even Northampton, with just a population of 5,000, had a total of 3. By 1800, London's associations had risen up to 1,800, so it had grown from 1,000 in 1750 to 3,000 in 1800. So dynamic period of growth in these types of clubs and associations and societies. In addition, there was something known that a historian called Peter Borsay has termed the urban renaissance of provincial towns. Large market towns like Northampton may have had just 3 types of clubs and societies, but they built assembly rooms, new theatres, a concert room, pleasure gardens. All of these types of developments spread around many provincial towns, and indeed there were new resorts built on the seaside like Brighton, or spa towns as in Bath and Cheltenham, where genteel society would gather during the course of their season to visit their theatres and concert rooms and pleasure gardens. And there was also, finally, the proliferation of print media, most importantly, the newspaper. Censorship had been removed in 1695, and by 1709, London alone boasted 19 newspapers, including the first ever daily newspaper. By 1820, the number of newspapers had grown to 52. The first provincial paper had been published in Norwich in 1701, but by 1760, there were 35 provincial papers, and by 1820, 100. And that's just the number of papers being published. If we talk about the actual numbers of newspapers sold, we have still more dramatic numbers. So there have been 2.5 million newspapers sold in 1700, and we know that because they were all subject to stamp duties. But by 1800, there were at no less than 17 million newspapers. So a growth in the century from 2.5 million to 17 million. And we must not assume that those figures of newspapers sold represented their total circulation, for just like the Spectator, many newspapers were read by many people. It's estimated that in London in the 1820s, every newspaper was read by at least 30 people. Alongside the newspaper came new forms of print media, most famously the birth of the novel, a work of fiction centered upon the interior lives of the individual and the portrayal of recognizable social types. There are many arguments between literary critics about which was the first novel, but they stretch from Aphra Behn's Love Letters Between a Nobleman and Sister in 1687 to Defoe's Robinson Crusoe in 1790 and Samuel Richardson's Pamela in 1740. Again, novels like this had tiny print runs, but they circulated alongside a huge variety of learned and religious publication through a growing number of private and commercial lending libraries that numbered almost 600 by the 1790s. The number of books in print during the 18th century basically doubled from 21,000 in 1700 to 56,000 in 1800. Now, it's often suggested that women were barred from this new enlightened culture of debate and association, that women were conceived as creatures of biology and emotion, not capable of rational thought. Indeed, it was suggested by many that novels were particularly dangerous for women because they encouraged flights of imagination and fancy. But we also know that many women, or some women, not many women, some women like Aphra Behn, Mary Astell, Catherine Macaulay, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Jane Austen, joined this Republic of Letters, despite its gendering as predominantly male. And you can see in this image of a coffee house behind me from Ned Ward's The Coffee House Mob in 1710, that the only woman visible in the picture is the one serving the coffee behind the bar. Now, I want to very briefly, and I have to do this very briefly because I'm running out of time, talk about the way in which the anti-slavery movement represented the convergence of evangelical culture and new strains of enlightened rational thought. And it combined these in such a way as to become the most popular political mobilization of the 18th century, dwarfing that of the Wilkite agitation I talked about last week. So the question I want to ask is, how did this happen? The anti-slavery movement, I'm suggesting, is characteristic of this new civil society that had emerged during the 18th century. Well, in the first part, it made use of these new cultural forms of circulation of newspaper, the availability of printed materials through circulating libraries, and the growing habit of association in new types of clubs and societies. And it combined new ideas, new enlightened ideas. So Adam Smith in 1776, in his Wealth of Nations, critiqued the institution of slavery for preventing the free circulation of trade and labor. It became for him characteristic of the type of mercantile economy that had to be replaced. A classic demonstration of an enlightened critique of slavery. But we also know that the anti-slavery movement was importantly energized by evangelical ideas, not least through figures like Grenville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and William Wilberforce, all of whom believed that the slave trade was a dreadful stain on Britain's moral conscience. Some, like Sharp, even believed that Britain had lost the American colonies in the War of Independence after 1776 as a punishment by God for its role in the slave trade, and that only abolition could make Britain morally clean and lead to the growth and maintenance of its empire. But we also know that anti-slavery was importantly a consequence of new types of geopolitics. For instance, British government offered freedom to slaves in return for their support as loyalists during the American War, and that 10,000 refuge slaves made their way free to Britain at the end of that war. Indeed, it was Sharp's campaign for their relief that culminated in the resettlement of many of these free slaves to the new colony of Sierra Leone and the establishment of a so-called free black state in 1808. So there were these new ideas circulating that were important, but there were also new campaign tactics that the anti-slavery movement developed. It formed its own committee for the abolition of the African slave trade in 1787, which had a network of local agents and so-called country committees across the country whose job was to disseminate the printed materials that primarily emanated from London or sometimes from at the country committees. Its leaders toured the country to deliver speeches just as evangelical preachers had. And they developed an unbelievable machine for gathering petitions. So the first petition against the slave trade collected 11,000 signatures in and around Manchester in 1787. By 1788, 103 petitions across the country had been collected against the slave trade, and by 1719, 519 petitions, the largest number of petitions collected by any one during the 18th century by a considerable distance. And finally, the slave trade also developed a new campaign techniques through the sugar boycott. In 1791 to 1792, it's reputed that the sugar boycott, the boycott of slave-produced sugar, was supported by some 300,000 consumers, and this provided many women a key role in the anti-slave trade movement. Another part of their new campaigning tactics was the development of new types of publicity. And the two most famous examples here, which I'm going to briefly gesture to because I don't have time to fully go into, was the medallion, Am I Not a Man and a Brother, produced by Thomas Clarkson's friend, Josiah Wedgwood of the Lunar Club, which became hugely popular both in Britain and the United States. Similarly, the use of the publication of Equiano's interesting narrative, which you have as one of your readings for this week in 1789, was the first attempt to provide slaves with a voice and a personality, and became hugely influential and across the movement. So I'm suggesting, and I don't have detailed time to get into the precise mechanisms through which the slave trade was abolished. I'll hopefully cover that in another lecture. But what I'm trying to say is to you that the anti-slave trade movement is a perfect demonstration of the way in which enlightened and evangelical ideas and a new culture of association had developed during the 18th century. So let me finish this rather breathless lecture by insisting that the world was not completely transformed by the emergence of a new type of enlightened civil society in the 18th century. The vast majority of Britons were remarkably unaffected by the influence of the evangelical revival or the Enlightenment. Popular culture remained in many ways a world apart. Its organizing principle was not reason or the transformation of the soul, but custom. Now, what was custom? Custom was the inherited pattern of past practice, or the claim that certain traditions stretch back time out of mind. In many ways, customs was not unlike a right, what we would today call a right. It was a claim to something being legitimate and natural, except that rather than being based on general principles, it was rooted in the authority of the past and was handed down locally through oral culture. It was locally specific and had no general principles, being rooted in an orally transmitted local culture. Now, the irony is that we know most about the persistence and importance of custom by those evangelical and Enlightenment reformers who characterized it as rowdy and sinful, or disdained its irrational and superstitious ways. Indeed, part of the Enlightenment project was to provide studies of customary culture, of the variety of different cultures, and to provide, in a way, a national portrayal of the practice of these customary pursuits. And in many ways, the very first of these studies, Henry Bourne's Antiquitatis Vulgaris, or the Antiquities of the Common People, with proper reflection upon each of them, showing which may be retained and which ought to be laid aside, that was the full title, first published in 1725, set the tone for the following studies. Indeed, it was reissued by other authors in 1777 and 1883. And in large way, its portrayal of custom was very similar to Hogarth's print here of the Cockpit, produced in 1759. In it, one of the big things that is being shown here is that custom tended to generate cruelty to animals. Customary sports like cock and dog fighting, or the baiting of bears and badgers and bulls, became a huge target for evangelical reformers. Indeed, there were parliamentary bills for their abolition were debated in 1800, 1802, 1809, and 1810, and eventually in 1824, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty of Animals was established in 1824 and succeeded in getting cockfighting banned in 1849, while interestingly other customary pursuits that were cruel to animals, like fox hunting on aristocratic estates, weren't banned until 2004. So in this sense, the cruelty of custom was very much in the eye of the beholder, and were continued to hold for a very long time. Indeed, even in 2004, the attempt to abolish fox hunting was rejected by the House of Lords no less than 3 times. So, as we see in Hogarth's image, there's a certain cruelty towards animals, but there's also a characterizing a portrayal of custom as generating a certain alcoholic looseness, a free flow of alcohol, and of rousiness. And worse still, it encouraged gambling. All of these things were considered to be deeply immoral and sinful. Indeed, the customary calendar of fair days and local saint days and holidays that structured most communities were full of strange practices, from the sale of wives, the playing of rough music on pots and pans, cross-dressing, all of which seemed to turn the world upside down and invert normal social hierarchies in profoundly unsettling ways for many people. Now, the lack of respect and morality of these vulgar customs were explained by Enlightenment and evangelical writers as survivals of an almost pagan or pre-Reformation Catholic past, remnants of an earlier point of civilization. But it's important to emphasize that despite this reforming effort, despite the reforming zeal of these reformers, the old customary world did not disappear. And one important illustration of this is the way in which magic continued to play a really important life for many people, and became, indeed, in some ways, re-energized by new forms of print, not new forms, but the proliferation of print media. Magic and superstition was not a casualty of the Reformation and the Enlightenment. This was the big argument of Keith Thomas's famous book, Religion and the Decline of Magic. Indeed, magic and superstition continued to flourish. Astrology and supernatural thought, in particular, remained powerfully important. And you can see this in the publication and proliferation of almanacs. Almanacs which organized the calendar year around customary holidays, also provided astrological charts and prophecies that would help people decide when was the best time to plant their crops or to harvest their crops and so forth. Almanacs were the most popular form of printed publication in the 18th century, and more so than the Bible. 400,000 were sold every year by 1700, and neither did their popularity diminish during the 18th century. Indeed, by 1834, one of the most popular of the almanacs, Old Moore's Almanacs, sold 517,000 copies alone in 1834, when it was estimated that the total sales of almanacs exceeded 1.4 million in total. So, custom is both a point in which, a testing point for the limits of evangelical and Enlightenment thought, and yet is reanimated by the new forms of the proliferation of new types of print media that developed in the 18th century. So let me conclude. The New Oxford History of Britain had 2 volumes covering the time period that I have been covering, published, I should think, in the 1990s or early 2000s. And they had radically different titles. One was called A Polite and Commercial People, and the other was called A Mad, Bad, and Dangerous People, ? And in a sense, this is the conundrum that I've been trying to explain to you today. How is it that we can make sense of, on the one hand, an intransient ancient regime founded upon the archaic authority of the monarchy, the church, and the aristocracy, and this precociously modern country that was supposedly the basis of a new, increasingly plural and enlightened civil society? What I've been trying to suggest to you today that this is a false dichotomy. We don't have to decide whether Britons were polite and commercial or mad, bad, and dangerous. They could be and were both at the same time. Because the socially entrenched nature of the ancient regime and the various exclusions it embedded helped generate new forms of association and sociability, as well as an enlightened critique of its monopolies of power and authority. And those critiques came from 2 sources, from the reason and from the soul. So I haven't been suggesting a straightforward account here of the forward march of Enlightenment thought. I've been trying to suggest to you also that religion, as much as reason, was the midwife of civil society and the development of this new type of civil society. And we saw that, I hope, most clearly in the emergence of moral reform movements. But I've also been trying to show that the development of this new enlightened civil society was not straightforwardly a type of emancipation from the ancient regime, for it also provided Britons with new conventions of behavior and forms of rule. And we saw this, I hope, in the example of custom, which was increasingly portrayed as an immoral and irrational series of ways of organizing and thinking about the world, and yet which was in many ways reanimated by its attack as being no longer rational or moral. And lastly, I've been trying to suggest to you that we should not think that the emergence of a new type of civil society in the 18th century simply displaced the ancient regime that it challenged. Instead, this new type of civil society became enmeshed in many ways with the ancient regime, an ancient regime that at the end of the 18th century remained no less entrenched than it had been in the early 19th century. That in many ways the civil society grew on top of it and was propagated by it. Now, in our next lecture next week, we'll look at another reason why the ancient regime remained powerfully entrenched at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, in the story of the new forms of economic transformations that occurred in the 18th century and culminated with the Industrial Revolution. Okay, thank you very much, and see you then.